Clean it up because that's the only value you've got.
Derek Mitchell, the martial arts coach, spat out each word with contempt. The students stood in a semicircle, some forcing awkward laughs, others turning their faces away. Derek commanded the scene as if he were directing a cheap play, turning the janitor into the class clown for everyone's amusement. James Washington, 42, quietly set the broom down. For the past 3 weeks, he had been nothing more than the man who cleaned this place. Invisible, silent, slipping in and out after class. A man who looked as if he belonged to the shadows. But when James straightened his back, shoulders relaxed, breath steady, the look in his eyes silenced the room. That stance did not belong to someone who mopped floors. Derek had no idea that some secrets never disappear, they only sleep. And tonight, under the cold lights of the dojo, that secret was about to awaken, to show everyone that when the one who's been scorned finally takes a step forward, the balance of power can shift in ways no one expects. The fluorescent lights above cast their glare onto the tatami floor, still heavy with the sweat from a long training session. At the center stood Derek Mitchell, coach, a black belt wrapped with authority, his head held high, eyes sharp and cold, as if to declare who truly ruled this room. "Hey, you there, cleaning. Want to come up here and give us a little show?" His voice cracked like a command, slicing through the steady rhythm of mopping. James Washington, a 42-year-old black man, looked up from his mop. For the past 3 weeks, he had been the gym's new janitor, quietly slipping in after classes ended, working unseen. But tonight, the advanced training session had dragged on longer than usual. "I don't want to interrupt, sir. Just finishing up so you all can keep going," James replied softly, bending down again to scrub at a stubborn stain. Derek burst into arrogant laughter, the sound echoing through the dojo and digging into the unease of the 8 students present. A few forced chuckles followed, but in their eyes, discomfort was already showing. "Look at this, everyone. A man so scared he won't even set foot on the mat. What's the point of martial arts then?" Derek sneered. What he didn't know was that James had spent 20 years burying another life. 2 decades since he'd stepped away from the cage, carrying with him a tragic memory and a vow never to touch martial arts again. Not even his teenage daughter knew who her father once was. Derek strode closer, his smug grin still plastered across his face. "Just a little demonstration, a few basic moves. Let me show the students the difference between someone who truly trains and someone who only knows how to hold a mop." In James's chest, something old stirred awake. Not fear, but the familiar shiver of muscles honed by thousands of hours of training. When his eyes met Derek's, just for an instant, it was the black belt coach who instinctively stepped half a pace back. "It's just a simple lesson," Derek corrected himself, his voice wavering slightly, "so the students can understand what respect for martial arts really means." James set the water bucket down and rose to his full height. His movements were smooth, fluid, unnervingly precise. No janitor stood like that. The air in the dojo sank into silence. The students stopped, forming a circle around the mat. James spoke, calm yet resolute. "All right then, but when this is over, you'll owe everyone here an apology for turning this dojo into a circus." Derek let out another laugh, though the confidence behind it had thinned. "An apology? The one hitting the floor will be you." None of them knew that the man with the mop was once James Silent Storm Washington, 5-time consecutive world champion in MMA. A legend who vanished overnight after the tragic death of Tony Hammer Rodriguez, his closest friend and sparring partner. Since that day, James had disappeared from the glow of the fight world, leaving behind only a bitter vow. Never fight again. But some promises only hold until one's dignity is challenged. Derek adjusted his black belt, his voice booming again. "Come on, step up. Everyone, pay attention. This will be the most practical lesson you'll ever see about the difference between true class and social status." The students formed a half circle, some curious, some uneasy. A young Asian woman, Sarah Chun, whispered nervously to her training partner, only to receive a helpless shake of the head. Here, Derek pointed at James, we have the perfect example of someone who doesn't know his place. A dojo is for the elite, not for the lower ranks. James closed his eyes briefly. Those words dragged him back 20 years, to Las Vegas, where crowds once screamed the same insults before tragedy struck. But unlike back then, James now knew how to turn anger into a quiet power, stronger than any punch. "Sensei, maybe we should just continue the lesson. It's getting late." Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling. "Sarah Chun, you dare question my methods?" Derek barked, deliberately stressing both her first and last name to assert his authority. Sarah froze, fear flickering in her eyes. James saw that look, the very same look he once wore 20 years ago, waking from nightmares of Tony, the friend who never rose again after a fatal fall during a sparring session. The accident was ruled a misfortune, but James knew the truth. In a moment of anger at taunts about his skin color, he had lost control, and Tony had paid the price. Derek circled James with a sneer. "Come on, Janitor, just show us a basic guard stance. Or is that too much for someone who only knows how to hold a mop?" Laughter rippled through the room. But James didn't react. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the echoes of Las Vegas wash over him, then opened them again. That was when Derek made his first mistake. Derek reached out and gave James's shoulder a shove, a touch that seemed harmless but carried all the arrogance of a man who had never faced real consequences. James didn't budge. His feet were rooted to the floor like an oak sunk deep into the earth. To Derek, it felt as if he had just tried to push a concrete wall. The coach's smug smile cracked for the first time. "Interesting," James murmured, almost to himself. His voice carried no threat, no anger, just the eerie calm of a man who had walked through far darker valleys and was still standing. Derek failed to understand the danger. He pressed harder. "Hear that, class? He thinks it's interesting. Why don't we show him the difference between thinking and knowing?" Each jab, each mocking word, unwittingly stirred in James not rage, but something far more dangerous. The clear memory of who he truly was. When he stopped hiding, when the silent storm awakened. Sarah Chun clenched her fists. She sensed something shifting in the janitor's every breath. James's muscles tightened ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly. But to Sarah, who had devoured countless documentaries on Discovery, that subtle change was unmistakable. The stillness before a predator strikes. "Last chance, my friend," Derek growled, irritated by James's silence. "Play along with this little demo, or I'll have security throw you out. And guess what? You'll lose your job too." James slowly opened his eyes. When his gaze met Derek's, a chill ran down the coach's spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he once mistook for a harmless lizard. "All right then," James said, his voice deep and unwavering, plunging the entire dojo into silence. "But when this ends, you'll owe your students an explanation for why this place of learning was turned into a stage for humiliation." Derek burst out laughing, but the sound was laced with strain. "Explanation? He'll be explaining to the tatami when he's flat on it." What Derek didn't realize was that in the past 20 years, James hadn't just been running from his past. He had been mastering something few fighters ever achieve: complete control over his emotions. From the fury that had once destroyed a friend, James had forged a weapon, cold, precise, devastating. The students closed in, forming a tight circle, some eager, others uneasy. Derek crossed his arms, basking in the silence he mistook for respect. "Everyone, watch closely. You're about to get a lesson worth more than 6 months of training. You'll see the clear difference between those who live through martial arts and those who just mop the floors for us." James stood still, but his breathing had shifted. For a moment, he wasn't in Denver anymore. Before him loomed the National Arena in Las Vegas, 22 years earlier. He heard the jeers from that title match against Victor Demolition Man Petrov. "Look at that. Little black kid. Bet he won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter," a spectator had once screamed. That night, James won by TKO in the second round. But the victory spiraled into tragedy. The relentless weight of discrimination had driven him into losing control during practice. And Tony Rodriguez, his closest friend, never got up again. "Well, Janitor," Derek taunted, still circling James like a predator. "Show them a basic guard stance, or is even that too much for someone more familiar with a mop than a mat?" Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. She rose to her feet. 22 years old, a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, pursuing a master's in sports psychology, currently researching discrimination in athletics. What she was witnessing wasn't just living proof of her thesis, it was humiliation too blatant to remain silent. "Sensei Derek," Sarah spoke with steady resolve, "may I ask you something? Why do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who's only doing his job?" The dojo fell into dead silence. Derek turned, eyes narrowing, caught between shock and irritation. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who's the instructor here?" he snapped. "You are," she answered calmly. "But that doesn't mean teaching includes humiliation, especially when it reeks of prejudice." Some students exchanged uneasy glances. No one had ever dared to confront Derek this way. Blood flushed his face, caught between anger and embarrassment. "Prejudice?" Derek barked a brittle laugh. "This has nothing to do with skin color. This is about respect for martial arts and knowing your place." James opened his eyes fully. In Sarah's voice, he heard a familiar steel. It reminded him of Keisha, his 17-year-old sister, whose eyes never wavered against injustice. Keisha had walked into every debate at school, never afraid to defend the weak. But one night, she was gone, claimed by a stray bullet in a police crossfire. At the time, James had been fighting in Japan. He hadn't been home to protect his sister. Another loss, etched deep into memory, another tragedy added to the chain that had driven him away from glory. And now, Sarah's voice, resolute, defiant, ignited that image again. The flame of justice he once thought had burned out. For a fleeting moment, James thought of all the reasons he had walked away. Tony's death, the grief of losing Keisha, the long nights spent questioning whether a career could ever be worth 2 lives. How many times had he wished to disappear, to live an anonymous life, quietly mopping floors where no one would notice him? But tonight, in this room, a young woman had stood up, speaking for the justice he had abandoned. And James understood. Sometimes, a person just needs a reason to stop running. "Sarah?" Derek's voice dropped low, each word dense with venomous smoke. "If you don't respect the way I teach, maybe you should find another gym. This place isn't for people who think like you." The air thickened, the stench of threat seeping into every corner. Sarah shivered, but she stood tall, her eyes locked on her instructor. "I've paid my tuition, Sensei, and I believe everyone here deserves a training environment built on mutual respect, not humiliation." At that moment, James smiled. Not a timid smile, not one of surrender. A slow, deliberate smile. The smile of a man who had just found his reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, James had lived under the weight of 2 deaths he believed his fighting career had indirectly caused. 20 years burying Silent Storm, the name that once shook entire arenas. But now, seeing Sarah defend the principle of fairness he himself had abandoned, James remembered who he truly was. Derek. His voice rang out, deep and steady as a bronze bell. The entire room froze. "The girl is right. This isn't martial arts. This is you trying to make yourself important by dragging others down." Derek whipped around, his face blazing red with fury. "You dare lecture me about martial arts? You, a man who doesn't even know what a dojo is?" James stepped forward, and instantly, his posture transformed. His shoulders squared, his stance lowered, his feet slid into perfect form. so precise that any seasoned fighter would recognize it immediately. "Actually," James said evenly, "I know exactly what a dojo is, and I also know this place stopped being one a long time ago." A chill raced down Derek's spine. Something in the way James commanded space, in each grounded step, awakened his survival instincts. But wounded pride would not allow him to retreat. "Enough," Derek snarled, shifting into his favorite guard. "I'll teach you what respect means." Sarah watched, caught between fear and awe. As a sports psychology graduate student, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of competition footage, but never had she seen someone transform so completely. In just a few breaths, James had shed the skin of a janitor and emerged as a fighter. Every movement efficient, every breath controlled, radiating a stillness more powerful than any show of force. James closed his eyes, letting 22 years of muscle memory awaken. The drills, the victories, the lessons carved into him by the bloodiest cages in the world. When he opened them again, Derek was no longer facing a janitor. Before him stood Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world MMA champion. "Last chance to apologize," James said, his voice carrying no anger. "Only a strange kind of mercy. Apologize to her, apologize to your students, and make this place a dojo again." Derek laughed, but the sound was shaky, warped. "Apologize? You'll be the one begging for mercy when you're sprawled flat on this mat." James didn't react. He had seen enough. In seconds, he had read Derek completely. The high guard leaving ribs exposed, the habit of pulling his right leg back under pressure, the telltale twitch of his shoulder before throwing a punch. 2 decades away from the cage hadn't erased the analytical reflexes honed over a lifetime. Sarah felt the air in the room shift. The students unconsciously stepped back, like animals sensing the storm about to break. The atmosphere thickened, charged like the air before lightning. Derek kept spitting taunts, but in the midst of his laughter, James smiled again. A different smile. Not hatred, not vengeance. The calm of a man who had finally found a reason worthy enough to shatter a vow of silence that lasted 20 years. Derek assumed his familiar stance, feet shoulder-width apart, fists clenched at chest level, weight tipped slightly forward, the posture he'd used to intimidate countless beginners. But to James, a single glance revealed everything. The over-tense body-robbing fluidity, the poor balance, the glaring openings at the ribs. "What are you waiting for?" Derek bounced on his feet, his voice sharp with provocation. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost?" And then James moved. No theatrics, no showmanship. Just a subtle shift of his feet, a quiet lowering of his center, shoulders relaxing into a perfect horizontal line. To the untrained eye, it looked ordinary. But to those who could see, the transformation was unmistakable, like the moment a lion dips its head before the killing strike. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. 2 years of studying sports biomechanics hadn't prepared her for this moment, the instant when an ordinary man transforms into a predator. Subtle, terrifying, unmistakable. "Interesting," Derek muttered, his voice uncertain for the first time. He couldn't explain why, but instinct warned him. This was no longer a game. James took another step forward, and Derek, unconsciously, stepped back. A primal, instinctive movement. The entire class saw it. A black belt instructor, retreating before janitor. The balance of power in the room shifted completely. "Is there a problem?" James asked quietly, his calm voice echoing through the dojo. Blood rushed to Derek's face. His honor, his authority, his entire facade of dominance before his students, all of it was being challenged. He couldn't back down, even though every cell in his body screamed at him to stop. "No problem." Derek forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. "Nice stance. Did you learn that off YouTube?" The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The air in the dojo was heavy, stretched taut like a wire. "Actually," James said evenly, "I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it." The name made Derek frown. He recognized it vaguely, but couldn't place it. Las Vegas. Some weekend boot camp? While Derek scoffed, Sarah Chun discreetly pulled out her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen. Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts. When the results appeared, the blood in her veins turned cold. This wasn't a weekend course. This was the holy ground of martial arts. The training temple where, for 3 decades, the greatest MMA champions in the world had been forged. "Derek," James's calm voice now carried like a command. "Last chance. Apologize to Sarah for dismissing her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place of learning into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming the very thing martial arts was meant to save you from." The words hung in the air like smoke. In that instant, Derek could have chosen humility, salvaging a shred of dignity. But pride blinded him. He attacked. His first punch was textbook. A crisp jab, fast, clean, precise, straight from the manual. A strike that would flatten 99% of the opponents he'd ever faced. But James was not part of that 99%. In the blink of an eye, James slipped aside, light as water flowing around a rock. The jab pierced nothing but air. Derek staggered, off balance. "Nice punch," James remarked, his voice low yet carrying across the room. "Good speed, solid technique, but you telegraphed it the moment your right shoulder twitched." Derek spun, stunned. How could a man who never trained dodge so effortlessly? Without hesitation, Derek unleashed a 3-strike combo. Jab, straight hook. His signature sequence, the one that had ended hundreds of sparring matches. But this time, James was gone before any strike could land. Sarah's eyes widened. She tracked every move. The jab sailed over James's head as he dipped effortlessly. The straight cut through empty air as he leaned back, his spine curving in an almost impossible arc. And the hook, the strongest of all, whistled past his chin as James slid back half a step. "Interesting combo," James said calmly, his breathing steady. "Effective if your opponent just stands still, but you've left your entire left side open." Sweat broke across Derek's forehead. Never before had he thrown dozens of strikes without landing a single blow. Before him wasn't a janitor. It was a ghost. "Stop dancing! Fight me!" Derek roared, charging forward with a frenzy of wild strikes. That was when James decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Derek's punches and kicks tore through the air, never connecting. But this time, as he overextended, James was suddenly there, right in front of him, close enough to touch. The distance shrank to the span of an arm. "Derek!" James's voice was deep, calm, almost chilling. "Do you want to know the difference between someone who trains in a dojo and someone who survives the cage?" Before Derek could answer, James raised his right hand, not to strike, but to place his palm gently against Derek's chest. A soft touch, no violence in it. And then Derek flew, not shoved, launched, as if struck by an invisible wave. His feet lifted clean off the floor, body flung nearly 6 feet backward before crashing, down flat on his back. The thud echoed through the dojo. Silence followed. Derek lay still for several seconds, eyes wide at the ceiling, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. No pain, just the overwhelming force of a power on a level beyond imagination. "This impossible," he whispered, struggling onto his elbows. Sarah held her breath. 2 years of research into martial arts, hundreds of hours studying footage. And yet she had never witnessed anything like this. Power both elegant and devastating. No rage, no blood. Just the perfect application of leverage, timing, and energy transfer. "It's actually very simple," James said softly, extending a hand as if to help Derek up. "All it takes is understanding force, timing, and movement. I learned that over 22 years of professional fighting." Derek shook his head, refusing the hand, struggling shakily to his feet. 22 years? In what? Sarah spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cracked through the silence like thunder. "Don't you realize who he is?" Every eye turned to her. On her phone screen, the search results still glowed. Articles, photos, videos. James Washington, nickname Silent Storm, 5-time world MMA champion, one of the most technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after 22 years, after the tragic accident that took his training partner's life. The words fell like bombs. The air shattered. Derek's face drained of color. He realized he had just challenged and publicly humiliated a living legend, a man who could topple him with a single touch. 5-time world champion," Derek stammered. The arrogance, the bravado, it all vanished in an instant. James nodded gently. "I retired at 29. Since then, I've only done simple jobs, cleaning, fixing things, manual labor, a quiet life, no lights, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The transformation in Derek was almost unbelievable. The arrogant, boastful man of moments ago was now a trembling shadow, forced to confront the crushing truth. He had mocked a legend. I didn't know," Derek stuttered, his voice barely more than a breath. "If I had known, But if you had known," James cut in, his tone soft but razor-sharp, "you would have treated me kindly. And what about the others? The janitors, the ordinary workers, the ones without titles or pasts to defend themselves? Would you still have humiliated them?" The question pierced to the core. This was no longer about James or about any legend of the cage. It was about a toxic habit. Derek's arrogance, his belief that he had the right to demean others simply because they stood lower in prestige. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes burning. "Sensei Derek," she said firmly, "I've studied here for 2 years out of respect for your experience, but what I just saw wasn't teaching. It was bullying, dressed up as martial arts." Murmurs spread through the room. Students who had stayed silent now nodded, whispering agreement. The truth was plain, undeniable. "James," Derek's voice cracked, carrying humility for the first time. "I'm sorry, truly sorry. To you, to Sarah, to everyone here, I have no excuse." James inclined his head, calm, as if he'd been waiting 20 years for this moment. "I appreciate that apology, Derek, but apology is only the first step. What matters is how you change from this day forward." Derek glanced around the room, meeting the disappointed, questioning stares of his students. He took a deep breath, nodded faintly. "I will change. It may take time, but I will change." At that moment, Sarah's voice rose again, this time with a question that stunned the room. "Mr. Washington, have you ever thought about teaching again? I believe we could learn far more from someone who understands that true strength always comes with responsibility." For the first time that night, James smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Maybe, but I wouldn't want to teach techniques. I'd want to teach something greater. That respect doesn't come from belts or titles, but from character." The words hung in the air, striking deeper than any blow. Derek bowed his head, swallowing the most humiliating lesson of his life. The room was silent, each student reflecting on arrogance and its consequences. 3 months later, the dojo was transformed. James Washington was no longer just the quiet janitor. With Sarah's persuasion, the gym's owner invited him back, this time as a special instructor in advanced technique and martial philosophy. And Derek Mitchell. Half the students left within the first week. The video Sarah had secretly filmed spread across social media. A black belt coach defeated by a janitor. Derek's reputation in the martial arts world collapsed. He continued teaching at a smaller dojo, but now with a humility born from humiliation. The price of arrogance. One evening, after a special class, Sarah stayed behind to help James put away equipment. She looked at him and smiled. "Thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be flaunted to be recognized." James smiled back, folding the heavy punching bag neatly. "The most important lesson is simple. Never judge anyone by their job or their appearance. Everyone carries a story inside them, a story that just might surprise you." This story does not end with a knockout, but with change. Derek came to realize the true cost of arrogance. Sarah found new inspiration to keep fighting for fairness, and James, the silent storm, proved that the greatest victory is not inside the cage, but in conquering oneself. Because sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with a clash of swords, but quietly, like a storm, sweeping away pride and leaving behind only respect and character. And what about you? If one day you were looked down upon, would you choose silence, or would you rise to prove your worth in the noblest way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share this video if you found the story meaningful, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring story.